Chapter 5, the first response to antigen. What exactly is it that the USMLE requires me to know? Well, we need to know what is the meaning of an antigen versus an epitope versus an antigenic determinant and an hapten. We need to know the sequence of inflammatory events and their role in the initial response to invasion. We need to know the mechanism and chemoattractive molecules involved in phagocyte extravasation, the steps of phagocytosis and mechanisms of intracellular killing, the meaning of opsonization and the molecules involved, and the clinical sequelae of defects in chemotaxis and phagocytosis, where we will be needing LAD and CGD. So let's talk about the definitions we need to know. So historically, the word antigen was meant to designate a substance capable of inducing the formation of a specific antibody, an antibody generating substance, so to speak. Today, the word antigen is used almost interchangeably with the word immunogen. An immunogen, on the other hand, is an immune response generating substance. So there's a difference. Do you activate the immune or do you activate the production of antibody? Clearly, you'll need to activate the immune to generate an antibody. Anyhow, so when this word is used, and antigen is used interchangeably with the word immunogen, it is used so as to encompass any substance capable of activating and generating a response from any committed lymphocyte. Now, for a molecule to be an immunogen, it needs to fit three basic criteria. First of all, it must first be recognized as foreign to the body. Secondly, an immunogen must have a certain degree of chemical complexity. And thirdly, it must have a molecular weight of at least 5,000 to 10,000 kilodaltons. So, what's the difference between antibody and immunogen? An immunogen initiates an immune response. An antigen will cause this generation of an antibody. And an immunogen is definitely foreign to the body. It has a complex chemical structure, and it has a weight of 5 to 10,000 kilodaltons. Okay, so now, B lymphocytes are capable of recognizing molecules of almost any chemical composition. The portion of the foreign molecule that actually fits into the idiotype of the B cell receptor is actually quite small. Now, 5 to 6 amino acids in the case of a protein, or 4 to 5 hexose units in the case of a carbohydrate. So an idiotype, remember the idiotypes of the B cells we talked about? Now in the B cells, that idiotype would be either the IgD or IgM portion, the top variable region of it. So that area can hold a protein as small as 5 to 6 amino acids. Or if it's a carbohydrate, can hold a carbohydrate that is about 4 to 5 hexose units. So that's pretty small. So anyway, this idiotype, this portion of the molecule that has the three-dimensional complementarity with the idiotype, is called the epitope or antigenic determinant of the immunogen. So basically, an epitope will bind to the idiotype. The antigen's epitope, for instance. So an antigen is a bigger molecule. The epitope is a specific part of that antigen that binds to the antibody. Antibody. It is also called the antigenic determinant of the immunogen. So because most of the microbes that challenge the immune systems are quite large, most naturally occurring antigens have many copies of the same epitopes. So an antigen may have different copies of the same epitope all over it. Okay. So here's some, okay, let's carry on. So the idiotype of a cell receptor fits the epitope or the antigenic determinant of the antigen. All right. So the size of a molecule is a critical factor in its immunogenicity because the B lymphocytes can only be activated when their antigen receptors are cross-linked by the accommodation of more than one identical epitope. So why is it critical for the molecular size? Why is the molecular size critical? Because the B lymphocytes will only be activated when their antigen receptors are cross-linked by the accommodation of more than one identical epitope. So you don't just need one antigen, you need at least two. And only once the B lymphocytes has bound two or something, only then will the B lymphocyte become activated, meaning the IgM and IgD will activate IL alpha and beta, and then CD19 and then 21, and cause signal transduction all the way to the cell to cause things to happen. Anyhow, so what does this do? This serves as the first signal to then send the message through the signal transduction complex to activate the cell. Molecules that possess only one epitope are called haptens because they can occupy only one combining site of the double-armed B cell receptor. That's important because, okay, so we know what so an antigen is anything that'll cause an antibody to form. An immunogen is anything that will cause an immune response. Doesn't have to cause an antibody to form, but we use it interchangeably nonetheless. Now, of an antigen, suppose you have a big molecule of antigen, it might have different parts that will bind to the antibody. So that part that binds to that exact chemical area that binds to the antibody, that's called the epitope. It is also called the antigenic determinant of the immunogen, same thing. So the difference here is an antigen can have more than one epitope, but if it only has one epitope, that antigen in particular is called the hapten. And it can only bind like one variable arm of a of a antigen recognition molecule on the B cell, right? So T lymphocytes recognize peptides of 10 to 20 amino acids in length. That's pretty big. Only when presented to them in the groove of a major histocompatibility molecule on the surface of an antigen presenting cell. Why are they telling me this here? I suppose they're telling me that, okay, the T cells will not bind to haptens, they will not bind to epitopes, they will not bind to antigens, they will not bind to immunogens. They will only bind if they have been presented on a silver platter with the MHC molecule from an antigen presenting cell, so to speak. Okay, just as well, you know, you don't want to activate them for no reason. All right, so haptens are single antigenic determinants. All right, next page. Clinical correlate. So drug allergies to penicillin and other agents such as streptomycin, aspirin, sulfa drugs, succinylcholine, and some opiates can be induced by small doses of the drugs. And are not consequences of the pharmacologic or physiologic effects of the drugs. Interesting. So it's not that you had the drug, for instance, some kid comes in with a penicillin allergy. It's not because they ate penicillin and penicillin did something to their body and that body effect is causing it. No. It's actually components of the drug itself that are causing this reaction. So typically an allergic response occurs to 7 to 14 days following exposure. I see. So is that why people just say, okay, take the drug, come back to see me in 7 days, and we'll see. Okay. An allergic response occurs 7 to 14 days following exposure, and the first symptoms may be mild, so you gotta watch out for that. Make sure you don't miss it, you know. All right, subsequent drug exposures can result in severe and life-threatening anaphylaxis. So if you see a reaction happening, just stop. And because what it's trying to imply here is that if you have more and more exposure, it's more likely that your immune system will remember that and cause will remember that, and every time it's exposed, its response will be much, much higher. I think that's what it's trying to say here. Anyway, most drugs are low molecular weight compounds that are not capable of inducing immune responses by themselves. They act as haptens. Okay. So haptens do not induce immune responses. Is that what we're saying? Inside the body, however, these agents can become conjugated to body proteins, the carrier. And the hapten carrier conjugate serves as the immunogen for the ensuing allergic response. There we go. Okay, so basically a hapten binding, remember in the previous section we learned about how right there, because B lymphocytes can only be active when the antigen receptors are cross-linked by the accommodation of more than one identical epitope. So an epitopes, two epitopes have to bind for the cross-linking of a antigen recognition receptor to happen and trigger a signal transduction. A hapten will only occupy one combining site, so that will not trigger any cross-linking, and thus there will be no signal transduction, there will be no activation of the cell. However, here we see again that the drugs themselves are actually very low molecular weight compounds, and they just have one epitope, thus they're called haptens. But the problem is that, yeah, one hapten bound to the one arm of an antigen recognition molecule, it's not going to trigger anything. But because these haptens, what they can do is they can bind, or we can conjugate it to body proteins, and this hapten carrier conjugate, now it's an immunogen, and that's why you end up with a allergic response. Got it. All right, let me just go back to see I didn't miss anything. Good. All right, so that is clear to me now. All right, next, acute inflammatory response. So antigens are normally introduced into the body across the mucosa or the epithelia. Well, yeah, they do have to penetrate the epithelium to enter the bloodstream, right? Anyway, the acute inflammatory response is often the first response to this invasion. So the moment the antigen enters the body, if the immune system notices this, the first thing that they have is the acute inflammatory response. And the acute inflammatory response represents a response of the innate immune system to block the challenge. Now, what do we remember about the innate immune system? Mostly we have things like macrophages, monocytes, maybe dendritic cells, just general immune cells. So anyway, they have to come in contact with, and remember, all of these are antigen-presenting cells. It could also be B cells, right? The first step of the acute inflammatory response is activation of the vascular endothelium in the breached epithelial barrier. So we're saying, in a way, that the antigen has to enter blood. So if an antigen is sitting in the tissue and has not penetrated the blood endothelium, we will not have a response. It has to enter the blood, it sounds like. So vascular endothelium has to be activated, first thing. So the antigen breaches the epithelial barrier and the vascular endothelium is activated. What happens? So obviously vascular endothelium is a very important thing here. That's probably causing all the reactions and release of molecules to cause other cells to react. So what does the vascular endothelium do? So they release cytokines and other inflammatory mediators result in the area as a result of tissue damage. Um, so there's tissue damage as a result. Obviously, cytokines and other inflammatory mediators are released. And they induce the expression of selectin type adhesion molecules on the endothelial cells. So, okay, so I see where this is going now. So obviously, an antigen enters the body, but what about if you're having drugs? You just inhaled it. There's no trauma. I'm sure there's some other way of doing that. Anyway, uh, so there's a tissue damage, and as a result of that, cytokines and other inflammatory mediators are released, and now the vascular endothelium starts expressing selectin type adhesion molecules on their cells. So then the neutrophils are usually the first cells to bind the inflamed endothelium and extravasate into the tissues, peaking within 6 hours. So within 6 hours of any penetration injury, you will see neutrophils inside the tissues. Monocytes, macrophages, and even eosinophils may arrive 5 to 6 hours later in response to neutrophil released mediators. So 12 hours later, in a way, 11 to 12 hours later. Once the neutrophils are in, they start releasing their mediators, and that attracts the monocytes and macrophages and eosinophils to that area. Okie doke. In a nutshell, the acute inflammatory response is a first response to invasion cytokines, increased expression of selectin type adhesion molecules. Steps in extravasation. So there's a bunch of steps. First step. Now we're talking about neutrophils trying to enter the tissue. The extravasation of phagocytes into the area requires 4 sequential overlapping steps. Step 1, rolling. Phagocytes attach loosely to the endothelium by low affinity selectin carbohydrate interaction. There is E-selectin molecules on the endothelium. The endothelium produces the E-selectin molecules. They bind to the mucin-like adhesion molecules on the phagocyte membranes and bind the cell briefly. But the force of blood flow into the area causes the cell to detach and reattach repeatedly, rolling along the endothelial surface until a stronger binding forces can be elicited. So you have the blood pressure in an artery, 120, 80, I don't know, well, 80 in the arterioles. That's pretty high pressure, and basically to slow down and put the brakes on, we induce the secretion of E-selectin molecules, which will bind to mucin-like adhesion molecules in the phagocyte, and they bind, they release, they bind, they release. It's just acts as a speed bump along the way. But then, in step 2, activation by chemoattractants. Chemokines released in the area during inflammation, such as interleukin-8, complement split product of 5A, and N-formal peptides produced by bacteria bind to receptors on the phagocyte surface and trigger a G protein mediated activated signal. Okay, this signal induces a conformational change in integrin molecules in the phagocyte membranes that increase their affinity for immunoglobulin superfamily adhesion molecules on the endothelium. Okay, so now we're not talking about the endothelium, we're going back to the tissue or wherever the trauma occurred. And that area is releasing a lot of chemokines. Basically, we've activated the complement. And complement's C5A, complement 5A, has been split. And one of the things that splitting does is produces interleukin 8. That is a chemokine. that attracts phagocytes. Another thing that attracts them are bacteria. They tend to produce any peptides filled with N-formyl area, N-formyl peptides. Um, and basically, they will bind, interleukin 8 and N-formyl peptides will bind to receptors on the phagocyte surface. And once the phagocyte has been bound to N-formyl peptide and interleukin 8, that will trigger a G protein mediated activated signal. So we got to figure out which. It's probably stimulation, GS. Anyway, so this signal will cause a conformational change in the integrin molecules in the phagocyte membrane. So now that integrin, before we said it was mucin-like adhesion molecules, well, now this integrin will change and will become more stronger and bind more securely to something. I'm thinking E-selectins. But anyway, it will increase their affinity for immunoglobulin superfamily adhesion molecules on the endothelium. Well, yeah, so that sounds like E-selectin. But notice that they are also immunoglobulin superfamily adhesion molecules. Okay, step 3, arrest and adhesion. Interaction between integrins of the phagocyte and Ig superfamily cellular adhesion molecules, IgCAMs, mediates the tight binding of the phagocyte to the endothelial cells. Okay, these integrins, immunoglobulin superfamily cellular adhesion molecule interactions also mediate the tight binding of phagocytes and their movement through the extracellular matrix. So remember how we were having these E-selectins on the endothelium and the mucin-like adhesion molecule in the phagocyte, kind of loosely attached and rolling along, attached with detached, detached. And then eventually, once these phagocytes are bound with interleukin 8 and N-formyl peptides, they cause a change in their integrin molecule. And then because of that conformational change, now that integrin will bind tightly to the, I'm thinking E-selectin. But anyway, any Ig cellular immunoglobulin superfamily adhesion molecules on the surface of endothelium. And so they will tightly bind to the endothelial integrins, and even they will continue to, that's how they're going to get inside the extracellular matrix, and even when they're inside the matrix, they're going to use their integrins to bind. Okay, so step 4, transendothelial migration. So now the phagocyte extends pseudopodia through the vessel wall and extravasates into the tissues. So now that it's anchored, it can do that. Okay, here we have a picture, another picture. I think once in the tissues, neutrophils express increased levels of receptors for chemoattractants and exhibit chemotaxis, migrating up a concentration gradient toward the attractant. Neutrophils release chemoattractive factors that call in other phagocytes. All right. So let's take a look at this picture here. Oh, that's a lovely picture. Look at that. So this rolling phenomenon that we see here is because of loose binding and detaching of the, this is obviously a neutrophil, see, it's got multi-lobes, see. Anyway, so it's got all these little, what would you call, mucin adhesion molecules? Is that what they use the word, mucin adhesion molecules? Mucin-like adhesion molecules. Well, this mucin-like adhesion molecules on the surface are loosely binding to endothelium's E-selectin molecules. E-selectin molecules. So they attach, detach, attach, detach, and eventually this neutrophil is attached, or their surface is attached with inter IL-8, and it's also bound with N-formal peptides, and that will cause a change in the conformation of their integrins. And then they will be able to bind more securely to the endothelium molecules, and thus it definitely come to a stop. You see, arrest adhesion. And then they will go ahead and go extend pseudopodia. This is a pseudopodia, like a false foot, inside, in between these endothelium cells, and thus enter or extravasate inside into the tissues. And now you have a big old neutrophil inside the tissue. Let's see, what does this picture say? Step-up-phagocyte extravasation, CAM cellular adhesion molecule. Okay, so here we have a neutrophil. You see it's multilobed. You see it's got granules. And look at that, that's the integrin. Oh, I see. So this is the endothelial molecule. 1, 2, 3. Okay, step 1 over here. What's happening is this is E-selectin, obviously, on the endothelium cell, and it is loosely binding to mucin-like cellular adhesion molecule. This is the rolling step, obviously, right? Then obviously there's chemokines, and I don't know what this is, but anyway, you got chemokines and N-formal peptides, and you got interleukin 8. They're just acting as, they just bind this chemokine or chemoattractant receptor, and that will induce the integrins to change shape. So some signal transduction happens, cause the integrins to change shape, and eventually they bind to Ig superfamily CAM. So this is a different receptor than the mucin-like CAM. So that's important to note. Integrins bind Ig superfamily CAM, and mucin-like CAMs bind to E-selectin. Don't confuse. This Ig superfamily CAM is on the endothelial, and mucin-like CAM is on the neutrophil. What's happening in step 2 here? Step 2, we're being activated by IL-8 and N-formal peptides. Sounds good to me. So you got 1, 2, 3. Step 4 is making itself into a podocyte and extravasating into the tissues. So here's a clinical correlate. Leukocyte adhesion deficiency. Now that is a rare autosomal recessive disease in which there is an absence of CD18. Okay. So there's no CD18. What is CD18? It is a common beta 2 chain of a number of integrin molecules. Okay, so we have integrin molecules, and they have the common beta B2 chain of a number of integrin molecules. So integrin molecules have a beta 2 chain, and that beta 2 chain is the CD18. So CD18 is part of the integrin molecule. So integrin molecule is bigger. Okay. A key element in the migration of leukocytes is integrin-mediated cell adhesion. Obviously, that's very important. Bone anchor otherwise. So you will have rolling, you'll have the triggering by IL-8 and formal peptides, but what you won't have is the adhesion, direct adhesion from integrin to Ig CAMs on the endothelial cells. So a key element in the migration of leukocytes is integrin-mediated cell adhesion. These patients suffer from an inability of their leukocytes to undergo adhesion-dependent migration into sites of inflammation. The first indication of this defect is often omphalitis. Now, what is omphalitis? Omphalitis is a swelling and reddening around the stalk of the umbilical cord. It doesn't heal. So this is the first site. These patients are no more susceptible to virus infection than our normal controls, but they suffer recurrent chronic bacterial infections. So they can get virus infections here and there, whatever, but then they heal and they're just fine. But the problem is that they will have constant bacterial infections. Patients frequently have abnormally high numbers of granulocytes in their circulations. But migration into sites of infection is not possible. So abscess and pus formation do not occur. I see. So that's pretty bad. You'll have increased levels of leukocytes in your blood, but because you're constantly attracting them because of injury, but they can't enter the tissues, and so they never heal or fight that tissue bug. One method of diagnosing leukocyte adhesion deficiency involves evaluating expression or lack of the B chain, CD18 of the integrin, by flow cytometry. Okay. Bacterial infections in these patients can be treated with antibiotics, but they reoccur. If a suitable bone marrow donor can be found, the hematopoietic system of the patient is destroyed, oh my gosh, with cytotoxic chemicals, and a bone marrow transplant is performed. Wow. I wish there was a way just to target those cells, but everything else seems to be fine though. Yowza. Everyone should go make sure that their bone marrow sample is given so they can donate. It's awful. Okay. So anyway, once in the tissues, neutrophils express increased levels of receptors for chemoattractants and exhibit chemotaxis. Okay, so anyway, once they form those podocytes and enter the tissue, they start producing or showing off more and more receptors so that they can feel their way through the ECM. So they exhibit chemotaxis, basically migrating up a concentration gradient toward the attractant. So obviously, they try to see where most of the chemoattractants are coming from, and that's the direction they start to move. Neutrophils release chemoattractive factors that call in other phagocytes. So once they're at the location, they start producing their own chemoattractive factors. Before it was something else that was calling them to that area. Well, when they get to the destination, they send out their own siren, and that will attract, particular specific immune cells that are needed, specialists that need to arrive at site, basically. So, chemoattractive molecules. Obviously, we know about the chemokine IL-8. Where do they come from? Basically, tissue mast cells. They come from platelets, neutrophils, monocytes, macrophages, eosinophils, basophils, and lymphocytes. I wonder if you can say it's an innate immune system. I don't know. Lymphocytes, well, can be T cells, right? Could be B cells. Complement split product C5a. Well, one of them was IL-8, wasn't it? But other products that come out of C5a is classical alternative pathways, right? So membrane phospholipids of macrophages, monocytes, neutrophils, mast cells will produce arachidonic acid. Eventually, it'll cause a cascade, thus activating lipooxygenase pathway and thus producing leukotriene B4. So this is all showing me trauma or something happening to immune cells here. I'm not seeing anything about the tissue. Formyl methionine peptides released from microorganisms. This is the only thing. So it sounds like the endothelium cells are only going to activate E-selectins and IgCAMs. but the rest, and then the microorganism is producing and formyl methynyl peptides, and something between here, uh, them releasing formyl methynyl peptides is activating these mast cells, neutrophils, monocytes, and macrophages to start releasing IL-8 and and forgetting the complement split products, classical and alternative pathways. That's the tissue. That's definitely the tissue pathway. Okay, so that makes sense. So that's what's attracting. That's what's causing. So they release leukotriene B4, IL-8, C5a, formyl methynyl peptides. This is activating endothelium to start producing E-selectins, and they are binding to the rolling neutrophils to activate their integrins and cause direct fusion to Ig cams, and thus extravasating into the tissues and causing and via chemo attraction coming to the site of actions where neutrophils will start producing more of their chemoattractants. Let's see what's happening here. Acute inflammatory, the whole thing. This should be nice. Okay, so here we'll start in the blood. Or actually, let's start in the tissue damage, right? So there's a tissue damage. The bacteria has somehow entered your tissue. And so obviously, antibodies are binding to it, which will activate the complement and it will start to release C5a. Bacteria is also binding to macrophages, which will chew it up and present it, right? And then at the same time, there's endothelial damage, which produces bradykinin, fibrin, fibropeptidase, peptides, and plasmin. Fibrin, fibrinopeptides. And both of these are acting on the endothelium. Along with leukotriene, prostaglandins, IL-1, 6, TNF-alpha. This is probably coming from the macrophage. These things will cause they'll cause the expression of E-selectin molecule right there, and that will cause the passing neutrophil to start coming to a roll, form adhesion molecules with mucin adhesion molecule, cell adhesion molecule, right? It will bind to the E-selectin gently and release. And eventually what will happen is that it will bind directly to IL-8, or it will bind to the bacterial and formyl peptide, and that will cause the expression of an integrin molecule. And that integrin molecule will bind, I think that's an integrin molecule right there, will bind to IgCAM, and then that will allow them to basically stop rolling and then fuse through the endothelium and enter inside the tissue here. Well, okay, so here we're saying there are three things that can enter. You got the monocytes, the neutrophil, and the lymphocyte. And here you have the adhesion of IL-8 activating integrin. Here we have LFA1, IgCAM1. And here they don't name exactly what is doing that to the monocyte. Okay, so remember what's triggering the endothelium: leukotriene, prostaglandins, IL-1, 6, TNF-alpha, and histamines. Anyway, once these three cells are inside the tissues, they will feel their way through. They'll start expressing more and more receptors on their cell surface, and they will start to feel their way towards wherever these signals are coming most from, and eventually end up at the bacterial site. Once at the bacterial site, they will start producing their own chemoattractant molecules. So that's pretty explanatory. The only new things here I would say are basically that once the endothelium is damaged, it will cause a release of bradykinin, it will cause a release of plasmin and fibrinopeptides. And all these three things will cause the endothelium to start expressing E-selected molecules. Sounds good. Also activating macrophages are producing things, and mast cells are also activated here. And histamine is also acting on the endothelium. Apparently, histamine, prostaglandin, leukotrienes, bradykinin, fibrin, fibrinopeptides, and plasmin, they all induce the endothelium to start producing E-selectin, expressing E-selectin and Ig cams. Okay. So now what happens, now that the neutrophil is at site, you have phagocytosis. Once chemotaxis of phagocytic cells into the area of antigen entry is accomplished, these cells will ingest and digest particulate debris such as microorganism, host cellular debris, and activated clotting factors. This process, called phagocytosis, involves, wow, okay, extension of pseudopodia to engulf the attached material, or pseudopodia, fusion of the pseudopodia to trap the material in a phagosome, fusion of this phagosome with a lysosome to form a phagolysosome, and then the enzymes inside will digest it, and then it will join again, fuse with the membrane, and exocytosis of digested contents. Pretty explanatory. Next, so we're going to talk step by step with each thing, about each thing in phagocytosis. First thing, you have opsonization. Both macrophages and neutrophils have membrane receptors for certain types of antibody, such as IgG. And certain complement components, C3b. If an antigen is coated with either IgG or C3b, then these macrophages and neutrophils will bind it. Adherence in phagocytosis may be enhanced by up to 4,000-fold. Thus, antibody and complement are called opsonins. And the means by which they enhance phagocytosis is called opsonization. So, neutrophils and macrophages, they need IgG or they need C3b. All right, here we go. We see opsonization of a bacteria with antibody and complement C3b. Look at that. There's a macrophage. You have a C3b receptors and you have an Fc receptor. It's called CD16. How about that? CD16 is an Fc receptor for Ig immunoglobulin. How about that? And C3b receptor binds C3b. So that's nice. So macrophages expresses a C3b receptor and it expresses a CD16 receptor. The C3b receptor will bind C3b and the CD16 will bind the Fc region of IgG. That makes sense. So here's a bridge to microbiology. Protein A of Staphylococcus aureus impedes opsonization by binding to the Fc component of IgG. Okay, so this bug, Staph aureus, is going to produce this protein A, and instead this protein A will bind this Fc receptor. It'll coat this entire macrophage. So even if the antibody IgG is bound to Staph aureus, that antibody will not be able to bind to the Fc receptor because that Fc receptor already has a protein A on it. Smart little buggy, aren't we? All right. So it's actually almost acts like an octopus, or that produces ink into the sea and full of nutrients. Okay. Anyway. Intracellular killing. Now, during phagocytosis, a metabolic process known as the respiratory burst activates a membrane-bound oxidase that generates oxygen metabolites which are toxic to the ingested microorganisms. So, all right, to let me read this again. During phagocytosis, right, a metabolic process known as the respiratory burst activates a membrane-bound oxidase. So there's a membrane-bound oxidase, okay, and that will generate oxygen metabolites, and these are toxic to intestinal microorganisms. Yeah, I knew that. Two oxygen-dependent mechanisms of intracellular digestion are activated as a result of this process. So now that we have oxygen metabolites, what happens? So we're talking about digestions here. So you have NADPH oxidase and myeloperoxidase. Okay, NADPH oxidase reduces oxygen to superoxide anion, which generates hydroxyl radical and hydrogen peroxide, which are microbiacidal. And myeloperoxidase in the lysosomes acts on hydrogen peroxide and chlorine ions to produce hypochlorite, the active ingredient in household bleach, which is microbiacidal. How about that? Right, some really killer things here. Okay. In addition, the lysosomal contents of phagocytes contain oxygen-dependent degradative materials. These are lysozyme, which digests bacterial cell walls by cleaving peptidoglycan. You have defensins, which are cellular peptides that form channels in bacterial cell membranes. And then you have lactoferrin, which chelates iron, and hydrolytic enzymes, obviously, that will break things up using water. So lysozyme cleaves peptidoglycan. Defensins, they actually go ahead and make little holes inside the bacterial cell membranes. And lactoferrin chelates iron. And obviously you have hydrolytic enzymes. Okay, look at this. Let's look at the next picture. Metabolic stimulation and killing within the phagocyte. Okay, so we're at this phase. The bug has been ingested. Where is the bug? It does not say. I think is that the bug? I don't know. Okay, so you have lysozyme, defensin, lactoferrin, hydrolytic enzymes, right? Lysozyme contains myeloperoxidase, which is this is a bunch of reactions you're telling me. What is this circle here? Okay. Of course, we're going to talk about CGD here. Are you serious? We're done? I feel like we're missing a step. Okay, so here we go. We understand how, you opsonize here. The bacteria will bind C3b and IgG with C3b receptor and CD16. And then it'll form this phagosome. Once that phagosome fuses with the lysozyme, now this lysozyme joining together is what we're talking about. Now I'm trying to find the bug here. So this is a phagocyte. So you have a lysosome filled with lysozyme, which breaks down peptidoglycan, defenses with pokes holes, lactoferrin which chelates iron, and hydrolytic enzymes. Now, what do you mean contains myeloperoxidase? So okay, this myeloperoxidase is also in the lysozymes. Okay. And NADPH, I'm thinking, is also inside lysozymes. Anyway, so here's probably the bug, and you have O2, oxygen. Membrane-bound oxidase that generates oxygen metabolites. So there's some membrane-bound oxidase. Are we talking about NADPH oxidase? I think maybe we are. But anyway, that's probably an NADPH oxidase. And basically, you have oxygen in here, and that will go through. This is a membrane, a phagosome membrane. God. Finally. Okay, so you got a phagosome and a lysozyme. Okay. So what we're saying, phagosome is nothing more than the cell membrane that fused around the microbe. I'm thinking that's the microbe. Okay, so NADPH is found on the membrane, and it'll take oxygen and add another electron to it, making it O2 negative. And then O2 negative will be further, you will add another OH molecule to it to make it hydrogen peroxide, basically. Then that hydrogen, so that's all it does. It makes O2 negative and hydrogen peroxide. Okay. Now this hydrogen peroxide can directly kill the bug, but you can also use myeloperoxidase to add a chlorine molecule to it to make it a hypochlorite. And then that will definitely kill this bug. Okay, pretty scientific. So on the side, in a nutshell, intracellular killing mechanism includes toxic oxygen metabolites. Toxic oxygen metabolites are these things right here. Toxic halide radicals right there. And then you have lysosomal contents, lysozyme, defensin, lactoferrin, and hydrolytic enzymes. Okay. Clinical correlate, chronic granulomatous disease. Now, when defects occur in the ability of the phagocytes to perform their critical functions as first responders and intracellular destroyers of invading antigen, clinically important pathologic processes ensue, obviously. Such defects tend to make the patient susceptible to severe infections with extracellular bacteria and fungi. Okay. So, in chronic granulomatous disease, CGD, that is an inherited deficiency in the production of one of several subunits of NADPH oxidase. So I can imagine if you don't have NADPH oxidase in your membrane or it's defective, you're not breaking down oxygen into OH negative. O2 negative, or making it into a hydrogen peroxide. And without hydrogen peroxide, you don't have myeloperoxidase joining. They don't have the ability to join it to a chloride and make hypochlorite to kill the bug. So basically, that whole section is inactive, and you're basically dependent on lysozymes, defensin, lactoferrin, and hydrolytic enzymes. That's it. So oxygen independent killing. So let's read on. So the inability, so once you have a deficiency in NADPH oxidase, this defect eliminates the phagocyte's ability to produce many critical oxygen-dependent intracellular metabolites. So you can't make O2 negative, you can't make hydroxyl ions, you can't make 1O2, and you can definitely make hydrogen peroxide. So the two other intracellular killing mechanisms remain intact, which is myeloperoxidase plus hydrogen peroxide will make HOCl and lysosomal contents. Now, if the patient is infected with a catalase negative organism, the H2O2 waste product produced by the bacterium can be used as a substrate for myeloperoxidase. And the bacterium is killed. If, however, the person is infected with catalase positive organism, such as Staphylococcus, Klebsiella serratia, Aspergillus, the myeloperoxidase system lacks its substrate because these organisms tend to destroy hydrogen peroxide, and the patient is left with the oxygen-independent lysosomal mechanisms that prove inadequate to control rampant infections. So remember that catalase negative organisms will produce H2O2, And catalase positive organisms, though they produces, they will actually end up um, using up H2O2. So none is left. Thus, CGD patients suffer from chronic recurrent infections with catalase positive organisms. So remember Staphylococcus, Klebsiella, Serratia, Aspergillus. So these are 1 gram positive, 2 gram negatives, and one fungus that'll survive on. Pretty bad. Okay. So failures of phagocytic cells to generate oxygen radicals are easily detected by nitroblue tetrazolium reduction test or neutrophil oxidative index, NOI, a flow cytometric assay. Generate oxygen radicals. So what we do basically is that you take the patient's blood with enough, phagocytes in it, and you put them in nitroblue tetrazolium, and you see if they are able to break down oxygen. So I'm thinking they probably, nitroblue tetrazolium has H2O2 in it or oxygen in it. And once it is broken down, it will become blue. That would be normal, meaning that the patient's NADPH oxidase is working just fine. If it turns blue, we're just fine. But if it doesn't change from yellow to blue, then that means NADPH is not working. So this is a very important test. So we have to look to see if it turns blue. Nitroblue tetrazolium reduction test. If it turns blue, that means you're blue because you have CDD. CDD. Oh, and we're done. So chapter summary. An antigen or an immunogen is a substance capable of activating or generating a response from any committed lymphocyte. Remember the difference between antigen. Antigen is the one that activates the production of an antibody. Immunogen is the one that causes an immune reaction immune response to occur. To be immunogenic, a substance must be recognized as foreign to the body. They must have a chemical complexity and be in sufficient size. And I believe the size was at least 5 to 10,000 kilodaltons. The portion of an antigen that fits into the idiotype of an antigen receptor is called the epitope or antigenic determinant, except when they're very, very small epitopes. Haptens are single antigenic determinants that can only generate immune responses if they are linked to larger carrier proteins. This is the mechanism of the elicitation of many drug allergies, such as penicillin, sulfa drugs, a whole bunch of other drugs I say. I just want to review those real quick. Aspirin, streptomycin, succinylcholine. Oh wow, really? Succinylcholine allergies as well? And opiates. Streptomycin, aspirin, sulfa drug, succinylcholine, opiates. You don't have succinylcholine over the counter, I believe. Anyway, after antigen is introduced across an anatomic barrier, phagocytes, first neutrophils, then monocytes, will extravasate into the area of injury by, okay, remember monocytes, eosinophils, macrophages, they take about 12 hours. Neutrophils will take 6 hours. Will extravasate into the area of injury by first rolling, which is the binding of E-selectins to mucin cell adhesion molecules, activation with chemoattractants, which would be C interleukin 8, or it could also be the N-formal peptides binding, which will activate the production of integrins. Arrest adhesion. Once the integrins are activated, they will bind to the endothelial Ig cams and immunoglobulin cell adhesion molecules, and then transendothelial migration through pseudopodocytes, basically. Important chemoattractants include IL-8, C5a. Oh, hello, we have more. So once they're inside the tissue, IL-8, C5a, which is mast cells, leukotriene B4, which is coming from that whole arachidonic acid, um, and that whole arachidonic pathway. The N-formal methynyl proteins, which is coming, peptides, which is coming from the bug itself. Integrants of the phagocyte membrane bind to IgCAMs on the endothelia to mediate adhesion. Hello. Here we're kind of saying or insinuating that IL-8 and N-formal methynyl peptides and C5a and leukotriene B4 are also responsible for maybe triggering integrants, perhaps. Once through the endothelium, phagocytes are attracted to the area of injury by chemokines of the IL-8 family to form complement split products. Wait, so chemokines of the IL-8 family, complement split products, leukotriene B4, and formal methynyl peptides, all of them, same things, except you have complement split products. They're all attracting the neutrophils, monocytes, eosinophils, whatever, to the location of injury. Then once they get to the area, what you have is phagocytosis. And phagocytosis, you have the formation of pseudopodia that trap particulate material in the phagosome. That happens because of the joining of, in macrophages anyway, you have CD18, which is the Fc component of binding site of the IgG, and you have the C3b receptor, which binds to the C3b opsonin, which are bound to the microbe. And thus you bind that and you form a phagosome around it. Addition of lysosome, and you basically engulf it entirely. You end up with a phagosome with NADPH on it, right? And then you, in addition, add lysosomes, and they will cause intracellular digestion within the phagolysosome. And exocytosis of the digested material. Opsonization is the coating of particles with IgG or C3b or both to enhance engulfment. Ingestion is accompanied by the respiratory burst, which generates the toxic metabolites necessary to destroy intracellular material. So if you have somebody who has CGD, they will just probably have a bunch of phagolysosomes, and that's it. You know, the bug will still be alive inside them. Things like Staph aureus, anything that is catalase positive, they will survive. NADPH oxidase produces toxic oxygen radicals, and myeloperoxidase generates hypochlorite by adding chlorine to hydrogen peroxide. Lysosomal contains lysozyme, which breaks down peptidoglycan walls. Defensins, which makes the holes in the bug. Lactoferrin, which chelates iron so that the bug has nothing to eat. Hydrolytic enzymes, which are breaking things down using water, are also toxic to ingested material. Patient with chronic granulomatous disease, CGD, which is an inherited deficiency of NADPH oxidase, are susceptible to chronic recurrent infections with catalase-positive organisms. Yeah, I think I understand this. Now, just one more thing that I would review is maybe this NBT, nitrobutyrosolium reduction test. Basically, it's yellow, and once you add it to the blood sample of somebody and it stays yellow, that means you're normal, meaning that your NADPH enzyme is working just fine and dandy. But if it turns blue, that means that you did not hydrolyze. I'm sorry. If it's blue, if the yellow turns blue, that means you're fine. But if it doesn't do anything, then you're not fine. You know, because it didn't change. It didn't hide. It did not break down that oxygen molecule. Okay. What else here? What do we, anything new here? No, this is fine, this is fine, this is fine, this is fine. Here, yeah, this thing was loaded. Some things else, like endothelial damage, will cause a release of bradykinin, fibrin, no, peptides, and plasmin. That's important. And things like you need prostaglandin-leukotrienes, IL-1 and 6, and TNF-alpha. They are all activating the endothelium. I still don't understand exactly what's going on here. Like, what are these molecules? Um, they say it's maybe LFA1 on the lymphocyte, maybe ICAM1 on the endothelium membrane, but we don't know what this monocyte is doing either. Mast cells are producing histamines, obviously. C5a is another one. What else? What is this? Tissues that produce arachidonic cascade lipooxygenase pathway. That was what I was forgetting. Glucoside adhesion deficiency is basically CD18 is absent on the integrin of molecules. So this is a problem with the adhesion of the neutrophil or any white blood cell monocyte macrophage to the IgCAM. And we're talking about the integrin. Okay, so this is at step 3 level where we're having this problem. All right. And we totally understand this X-rays inflammatory response and okay. That was the only few things I would add to it. Now let's go to the questions. Yay. A rabbit hunter in Arkansas is diagnosed with ulceroglandular tularemia and treated with streptomycin. Within a week, he returns to the hospital. The tularemic papule, lymphadenopathy, and bacteremia have resolved, but he has now developed a raised itching skin rash and fever. The drug was discontinued, and the symptoms subsided. What was the role of streptomycin in this case? I'm thinking they're talking about the streptomycin itself becoming a hapten and binding to some protein and causing a reaction. It acted as a B cell mitogen. It acted as a hapten. Yep, sure did. It acted as a provider of co-stimulatory signals. Acted as a super antigen. Acted as an immune. Can't be immunogen because it's too small. Super antigen. Don't know. B cell mitogen. I don't know what that is. Provider co-stimulatory signals. I don't know. I think I'd go with B, hapten. Let me just go hide my answers. I don't know where they are. Here it is. I'm trying not to peek. Okay. So the correct answer is B indeed. Many drug allergies, such as the one described here, are hapten carrier immune responses. The drug is not large enough by itself to elicit an immune response as it is a hapten, but when it becomes covalently coupled to the body's own proteins, which act as carriers, the combined molecules becomes immunogenic, and a response against one's own tissues is elicited. So acting as a B cell mitogen is not correct. B cell mitogens such as pokeweed mitogen and lipopolysaccharide cause polyclonal proliferation of B cells and elaboration of IgM antibodies. Okay. The drug allergy described here is not a polyclonal response, but a specific anti-altered self-response generated by T and B lymphocytes and production of antibodies. Okay, so first of all, what is a B cell mitogen? Those are things like pokeweed mitogen and lipopolysaccharides. And what do they do, mitogens? They cause that B cell to keep producing itself over and over again so that you have one kind of IgM, one cell with a particular idiotype of IgM, lots of that in that blood, okay? The drug allergy described here is not a polygon, but a specific, so this response is a specific anti-altered self-response generated by T and B lymphocytes and production of antibodies. So you're producing antibodies. It's a full-fledged response. Acting as a provider of co-stimulatory signals is not correct. Now, what is a co-stimulatory signal? The co-stimulatory signal required to activate B and T lymphocytes include CD28 and B7 and CD40 and CD40L interactions. That is interesting and important. Okay, these are additional interactions beyond the specific recognition of antigen required for the activation of B and T lymphocytes. So in order to activate a B and T lymphocyte, not only do you need to activate IgM, IgD, or TCR, you also need to activate CD28 and B7, and you also need to activate CD40 and CD40 ligand. Although these co-stimulatory signals would be involved in the evolution of this allergic response, the streptomycin does not serve as a co-stimulatory signal. Okay, well, that's important to know that CD28, B7, and 40/40L interactions are necessary to activate B and T cells, respectively. Acting as the superantigen is not correct. Superantigens are materials that cross-link the variable B domain of the T cell receptor. Okay, and the alpha chain of class 2 MHC molecules. So remember that T cell receptor has alpha and beta chains. The beta chain is more like the heavy chain of is analogous to the heavy chain of the B cell immunoglobulin. Well, the alpha chain of MHC1 bind with the B domain of the T cell receptor. So that kind of like a handshake. They induce activation of all T cells that express receptors with a particular variable B domain. The resulting T cell mitogenesis causes overproduction of the T cell and macrophage cytokines and system-wide pathology. Yeah, I was just thinking it was going to be toxic shock syndrome. Toxic shock syndrome, toxin 1, and Streptococcus pyogenes, erythrogenic exotoxins, act as superantigens. So in a way, they probably do bind, usually T cell receptor will bind MHC2 for a little while, then they let go. But these superantigens don't let them go. They say, hey, keep on holding on. And so there's constant stimulation happening. As a result of that, you have this constant overproduction of T cells. The T cells keep producing themselves over and over again. And so the macrophages will keep on producing these cytokines. And so you have a serious pathology all over the system. I get it now. Cool. Okay, I'm hiding this with my hand. Acting as an immunogen is not correct because streptomycin is not large enough to be immunogenic. Immunogens must be large enough to have at least 2 epitopes. It is only through binding to a larger carrier protein, the patient's own tissue protein, that a hapten such as a drug can become an immunogenic compound. Roger Rabbit. During World War II, when quinine was used as a prophylactic against malaria infections in the United States, personnel on long-term assignment to the South Pacific, a small proportion of soldiers developed blackwater fever, chronic kidney damage from autoimmune effects of complement-mediated hemolysis of quinized red blood cells. So basically, they're peeing blood. In this case, quinine played the role of. So what's quinine doing? Uh, there's a kidney autoimmune effects of complement-mediated hemolysis of quinized red blood cells. So red blood cells with quinine were broken up due to complement. Quinine played the role of immunogen, hapten, carrier, autoantigen, or reagent. Well, it's more like, I mean, it could be a hapten because it's a drug. Immunogen because it was in red blood cells, but it sounds like it's inside. It's definitely not a carrier. Is it an autoantigen? No. Reagent? I don't even know what that is, but I doubt it. I just say hapten. Immunogen, no, because it's a drug. It's too small. I just say hapten. But why would they use the same question twice? Okay, the correct answer is C. Let's see what I got. Let's see. Hapten. Okay, but I don't understand why they're using this question twice. This is a case of autoimmune hemolytic anemia generated during a hapten carrier immune response. Autoimmune hemolytic anemia, hapten carrier immune response. Okay. The drug is not large enough to by itself elicit an immune response if it is a hapten, but when it becomes covalently coupled to a red blood cell protein, such which act as carriers, the combined molecule becomes immunogenic. But wait, they said hemolysis quinized red blood cells. Okay, so I taught that to mean that the quinine is inside red blood cells, but basically the red blood cells and quinine are holding hands together. It's not inside. Okay. All right, antibodies are generated and bind to the drug. Red blood cell complex. Complement is activated and red blood cells are lysed. Autoantigen is not correct because the immune response is being generated against an altered self component. The red blood cells of the patients are not themselves the immunogen. Okay, yeah. It is a complex of drug red blood cell protein that elicits a response. The effect is certainly similar to the autoimmune response. The patient destroys its own tissues. However, the eliciting immunogen is altered cells, so this is not the case where failure of self-tolerance causes disease. Gotcha. Carrier is not correct because carrier must be protein molecules. Should they? The carrier component of a hapten carrier complex is recognized by T lymphocytes. Okay, because T lymphocytes are only capable of recognizing peptides presented in the groove of major histocompatibility complex antigens, a molecule such as quinine is invisible to the T cell. Now I sound like a drill sergeant. I don't know why they always sound southern. Probably because that's where most of the military bases are kept in the South. Anyway, carrier is not correct because carriers must be protein molecules. Got it. The carrier component of the hapten carrier complex is recognized by T lymphocytes. T lymphocytes recognize carriers. Because T lymphocytes are only capable of recognizing peptides presented in the group of major histocompatibility complex antigens, a molecule such as quinine is invisible to T cells. Gotcha. So T lymphocytes only T lymphocytes recognize carriers, and this drug quinine is too small. Okay, immunogen is not correct because quinine is not large enough to be immunogenic. Same thing. Immunogens must be large enough to have at least two epitopes. It is only through binding to a larger carrier protein, the patient's own tissue protein, that haptens such as a drug can become immunogenic. Reagent is a word that is used to denote an immunogen that elicits an IgE response. Oh, okay. Um, Although some drug allergies are indeed IgE mediated, immediate hypersensitivity responses, this one is not. The antibodies that activate complement are IgM and IgE. IgE does not activate complement. So if you're going to cause the release, if you're an immunogen that causes the B cells to start producing IgE, you're called a reagent. But only thing that will activate a complement are either IgM or IgE, and we say that this has activated a complement. So that's why that's not the correct answer. Good job. Okay. Now, 3. A 2-year-old child who has suffered recurrent bacterial infections is evaluated for immunologic deficiency. Okay, the child has age normal numbers of CD19 and CD3. Okay, good. Cells in peripheral blood and an extreme neutrophilia. Not enough neutrophils. The nitro-blue tetrazolium dye reduction test is normal, meaning it turns blue, meaning NADPH oxidase is functional. What is the most likely defect in this child? So recurrent bacterial infections, it has normal B cells, normal T cells, NADPH oxidase is working fine, but you have extreme neutrophilia. Why would you have extreme neutrophilia? Maybe it's one of those leukocyte adhesion deficiency problems. I wonder. I am at a loss here. Let me see what the options are. Absence of CCR4, CD18, interleukin 1-4, tumor necrosis factor. I don't know. I feel like going with absence of CD18. Interleukin 1, IL-1, IL-4, tumor necrosis factor alpha. I'm probably wrong, honestly. I don't know. I'm just gonna go 3. Oh God. Now it's stuck. Oh my God, B is correct. Okay, this child has leukocyte adhesion deficiency. Yeah, but why neutrophilia exactly? Okay, this child has leukocyte adhesion deficiency, which is a genetic deficiency of CD18. CD18 is an essential component of a number of integrins, and absence of these molecules causes the inability of white blood cells to migrate to the sites of inflammation. Thus, in this patient, the blood contained abnormally high numbers of neutrophil. Oh, idiot. Neutrophilia, that means love of neutrophils, meaning you have lots of it, not neutropenia. I was thinking neutropenia. Right, so you have a lot of neutrophils, but they just can't get inside the tissue. But they are unable to extravasate. CD18 is a component of the LFA1, CR3, and CR4. What are those? I think we're going to talk about them. The absence of CCR4 would cause difficulties in extravasation and migration of activated T cells and monocytes. This chemokine receptor is not found on neutrophils and therefore would have no effect on neutrophil migration. I gotcha. Absence, so CD18, remember CD18? real quick. Aha, here we go. B2 chain of a number of integrin molecules. Integrins are on the leukocytes, the neutrophils themselves. Gotcha. So CD18, this information the blood contained abnormally high numbers of neutrophils, but they were unable to extravasate. CD18 is a component of LFA1, CR3, and CR4. And we did not cover what LFA1, CR3, and CR4 are exactly. But we will cover what CCR4 is. CCR4 is causing difficulties in extravasation and migration of activated T cells and monocytes. This chemokine receptor is not found on neutrophils and therefore would have no effect on neutrophil migration. So if they had talked about CCR4, which is for extravasation of T cells and monocytes, we could have been right. Anyway, it's not. Absence of interleukin 1. Interleukin 1 might cause difficulties in producing the acute and chronic inflammatory responses. That's the first response, right? This cytokine, frequently referred to as the endogenous pyrogen, produces fever, acute phase protein production, and many other results critical to inflammation. However, the actions of IL-1 are extremely redundant with those of IL-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha. So such a condition might have no clinical observable effects. So what does IL-1 do? It causes fever, thus called endogenous pyrogen. It also causes the production of acute phase proteins, and that will cause acute and chronic inflammatory responses. Similarly, IL-6 does the same thing, and so does tumor necrosis factor alpha. And tumor necrosis factor alpha might cause difficulty in producing acute and chronic inflammatory responses. This cytokine has many functions that are redundant with those of IL-1 and 6, so such a condition might have no clinically observable effects. Now, what is IL-4? IL-4 would result in defects in the ability to mount a normal IgE antibody response. I believe it was IL-5 that was responsible for the maturation of eosinophils. Remember? Anyway, IL-4 will result in defects in the ability to mount a normal IgE antibody response. This cytokine also serves as the major stimulus for the development of helper T cells, from naive helper T cells. So its absence would be likely to have a profound effect on all aspects of secondary antibody response. So IL-4 is responsible to cause B cells to start making IgE. They also act on the naive T helper cells to make them into helper 2 cells. Good job. Next question is about a 2-year boy who is admitted to a hospital, and he might have a possible immunologic disorder. Now we got to figure out what it is. His history is remarkable because he has multiple skin infections, which involve staphylococcus. Not just that, sir. It also has Pseudomonas and Candida infection. That is remarkable. So now we got to examine the child, and we notice that, hey, he's got cervical lymphadenopathy and mild hepatosplenomegaly. So lymph nodes and spleen are kind of big. Something's going on here. So we say, all right, let's do a blood test. And we see that it has an elevated erythrocyte sedimentation rate. and it has neutrophilia, meaning lots of neutrophils in blood. So we do the nitro-blue tetrazolium dye reduction test, and the neutrophil oxidative index are negative, meaning that it does not turn blue, which means that this child is deficient in NADPH oxidase. He might have CGD. What is the most likely defect in this child? A C3 deficiency. Well, C3b, I know of. Deficiency of CD18, that would just explain neutrophilia, but does not explain the nitrotetrazolium dye being negative. Myeloperoxidase deficiency doesn't say anything about that, so I don't know. And a DPH oxide deficiency, that sounds right. Phagocyte granule structural defect. I don't know about that. It's probably going to be D. Pretty sure about that. D, it is. This child has chronic granulomatous disease. The history indicates he has had recurrent infections with catalase-positive organisms and has a defect in generating oxygen radicals intracellularly in his phagocytic cells. Thus show this is because the negative nitro-blue tetrazolium test and the neutrophil oxidative index. This genetic defect arises from a failure to produce one of the subunits of NADPH oxidase, which makes the individual incapable of producing intracellular oxygen radicals. Redundant intracellular killing mechanisms, myeloperoxidase and lysosomal contents, are still functional in these patients, but when they are infected with catalase-positive organisms, such as Staphylococcus, Candida, Pseudomonas, the substrate for myeloperoxidin, hydrogen peroxide, is destroyed. And the only remaining intracellular mechanisms are those in the lysozymes. They are insufficient to protect from the infection. Now, the other option was C3 deficiency. The C3 deficiency would cause increased susceptibility to pyogenic infections because C3b is an important opsonin that enhances phagocytosis of extracellular organisms. All extracellular bacteria would be included in this list, not simply catalase-positive ones, as mentioned here. The nitro-blue tetrazolium test and neutrophil oxidative index would not be negative in this case. Deficiency of CD18 is the cause of leukocyte adhesion deficiency. Because CD18 is the common beta chain of the beta-2 integrins, its absence comprises leukocyte function antigen, as well as complement receptors 3 and 4. Compromises leukocyte function antigen. That's what LFA1 is. It's a leukocyte function antigen. And complement receptors 3, complement receptor 4. These are compromised. Patients with leukocyte adhesion deficiency suffer recurrent infection with extracellular pathogens, not just catalase-positive ones, because of defective opsonization, mobilization, adhesion, and chemotaxis. The nitro-blue tetrazolium test and neutrophil oxidative index would be positive here. Here's one thing. See, yeah, I get that CD18 is part of B2 integrins, but when it's not there, your leukocyte function antigen and complement receptors 3 and 4. Well, I know the complement C3b or C3 receptors there, but there's something called leukocyte function antigen as well. That's new to me. Let me just make sure that that receptor is called C3b. Yeah, it is C3b, but we're talking about a C3 receptor and a C4 receptor. Okay, I'll just remember that there's such a receptor. Next, Deficiency of myeloperoxidase results from a deficiency of an important granule enzyme in the phagocytic cell. So remember, myeloperoxidase is the granule. It's inside the lysosomes in the phagocytic cells. However, because there are so many reductant mechanisms of intracellular killing, these patients generally have mild symptoms or none at all. So if you had to have one of the two diseases, myeloperoxidase deficiency or NADPH oxidase deficiency, what would you want? Well, you take the lesser of the two evils, which is myeloperoxidase deficiency. All right. A phagocyte granule structural defect is responsible for Shida-Higashi syndrome. So it's a defect in the phagocyte granules structure. These patients have chemotactic and degranulation defects, lack natural killer activity, and have partial albinism. So that's new. Shida-Higashi syndrome. Basically, their granules don't fire. And so they have chemotactic degranulation defects because they don't degranulate. So as a result, they don't attract anybody close to them. And so natural killer cells won't be attracted. Why partial albinism, I don't know, but it's an association with Shida-Higashi. All right then. Up to 5. It has been learned in animal experiments that there are advantages to eliciting nonspecific inflammation at the site of inoculation of an antigen toward the ultimate development of a protective immune response to that immunogen. Okay, if you say so. Which of the following substances, if introduced with a vaccine, would serve the purpose of attracting a neutrophilic infiltrate into the area? So what do you need to attract a neutrophil? You're trying to attract a neutrophil to come to your party, basically. What do you start with? How do you basically promote it? How do you market that? Well, I would start producing IL-8s, especially C5A. C5A, I think, should do it. But let's see, what else? There's also that N-formyl peptides. Let's see what we have here. Complement component 3B, immunoglobulin G, interleukin 8, there it is, myeloperoxidase, and tumor necrosis factor alpha. TNF alpha is very general. Myeloperoxidase won't do it. Immunoglobulin G is very general. Complement component 3B, same thing as immunoglobulin G. So I'll just say with C. Let's see. Oops. Come on. Oh boy. The correct answer is C. The only substance on the list that is chemotactic for neutrophils is IL-8. The other neutrophil chemotactic factors that might have been mentioned would include C5A and leukotriene B4. We didn't mention that. And formyl methyl peptides. Complement component 3B is not chemotactic for neutrophils. It acts as an opsonin, enhancing phagocytosis of coated particles. Immunoglobulin G is not chemotactic for neutrophils. It too acts as an opsonin, enhancing the phagocytosis of coated particles. Myeloperoxidase is not chemotactic for neutrophils at all. It is an enzyme in the lysozymes of phagocytic cells, and that will generate toxic halide radicals intracellularly when exposed to its substrate, hydrogen peroxide, to make hypochlorite to bleach. Tumor necrosis factor alpha is not chemotactic for neutrophils. It is produced by macrophages and is involved with the production of chronic inflammatory reactions and cytotoxicity. I think that was pretty good, so we'll just stop there. Yeah, let's stop